All right, so we've got a closed group tutorial coming up, and we've got the topic for today, which is advanced exploitative tactics. So it's been a while since I've done a CGT, and it's been even longer since I've done a CGT on exploitation. So we'll just go through these slides and then just get going. All right, so today's learning outcomes. So I'm going to explain how to use reads to create the correct exploit and then describe the correct exploit for the variety of different types of players. And you'll be probably quite surprised about how vastly different exploitative play is to GTO play, especially if you're trying to grind out every penny you can out of your opponents. All right, so some review questions. So I'm going to ask you guys to answer these questions. We've got 3 questions. So what's the difference between exploitative and GTO play? What information is necessary to create an exploitative strategy? And how do you evaluate the strength of your read? So does anyone have any answers to any of these questions?
The difference? Go ahead.
The difference between GTO and exploitative. So GTO play is the plays based on under the assumption that your opponent is playing perfectly. So you've both maximally exploited each other to the point where you can't make a deviation in strategy to further exploit. Exploitative is taking a line against an opponent that's playing outside of GTO in order to maximize your EV against them without regard to balance or anything like that.
Yep, good. Anyone else have anything to add to that? All right, so in Zenith, I definitely think that exploitative play and GTO play are definitely 2 sides of the same coin. And quite often you actually do want to play as exploitative as you possibly can. And when you can't because you don't have a read or whatever, you have to fall back to GTO play. So you have to know both GTO play to play exploitatively. And so this leads to the next question. So what information is necessary to create an exploitative strategy?
Reliable information based on the profile of your opponent. Something with a large enough sample size.
Yep, so large enough sample size. Anything else?
You need to know the GTO strategies for the spot to formulate an exploitative strategy.
Great, excellent. So in order to create a good exploitative strategy, you have to know both the GTO strategy as well as have a very strong read on your opponent. Okay, and how do we evaluate the strength of our reads? And we've got an idea.
This is a tricky question. It could be by trial and error, like we adopt a strategy based on our reads and we keep sticking to that strategy until we see something opposite or different.
Well, purely the strength of our read just could be evaluated by our sample size. Now, if we're talking about the strength of our exploitative strategy, that would be a much more difficult thing to measure.
Yep, so sample size is one of the biggest ones. Having a much larger sample on the players that you're playing against means that the reads that you have are more accurate, and not just due to the random sort of nature of poker and people's play. Right, so really sort of the key word there is you're trying to find a tendency in the players that you're playing against, and that tendency has to be different from the GTO strategy in that spot. All right, so let's just jump through into the example questions. So start off easy. So how do we exploit a player that overbluffs on the river, and how do you exploit a player that underbluffs on the river?
I think we exploit the player that overbluffs on the river by calling all our bluff catchers, and we exploit the player that underbluffs on the river by folding all our bluff catchers.
Great. Anyone else want to add to that? That's a pretty good answer, I think. Even if the player is only slightly over bluffs, you can get away with calling everything or almost everything, and if the player is slightly under bluffs, you can get away with calling folding everything or almost everything in terms of the bluff catchers. And so you have to sort of define what bluff catchers are, but here in this sort of sense, a pure bluff catcher is a hand that's sort of weaker than your opponent's value and stronger than your opponent's bluffs. In a player that overbluffs, it might even be the case that you can, if they overbluff by too much, you can even start to call hands that are weaker than that would even lose to some of the opponent's bluffs. And against players that massively underbluffs, you can even start to fold hands that beat some of their value. Alright, so the answer there. Overbluff you call, underbluff you fold. That's pretty straightforward. Alright. Let's get a little bit more interesting, a little bit more complicated. So we have a read on this player, and we think it's a very strong read, and we think that the player overbluffs the flop and the turn, but then underbluffs on the river. So what kind of exploits are you going to make against this player? So they're overbluffing the flop and the turn, but then they underbluff the river. So what exploit are you going to make?
We're going to keep calling down and fold to the third barrel on the river, for example. So in general, street by street, we are going to overcall, flop and turn, and overfold the river.
Great. Anyone else have anything to add to that?
We would. Oh no, it's all right. we can jam semi-bluff, jam more turns.
Yeah, maybe that's a different thing that you can also do. But here in the case that they need to be overbluffing the flop and the turn. So I got the answer. They need to be overbluffing the flop and the turn more than GTO, and then underbluffing the river less than GTO, in order for that sort of thing for this sort of line to be profitable. If they're simply just underbluffing the river, but then they triple barrel, because of the presence of underbluffs on the river, that sort of bleeds over to the flop and the turn. So then you start to overfold the flop. So you need to have a much stronger read here than in example 1, right? Because here you're thinking about a multi-street read, and it needs to be very, very strong. Okay, you need a much larger sample size to determine that they both overbluff the flop in the turn and underbluff the river in order to make this multi-street sort of play against his opponent. And in general, right, don't overthink it. If your opponent isn't bluffing on a certain street, overfold, and your opponent's bluffing too much, underfold, right, on that specific street. Alright. This is making sense to everyone. Signing off easy.
Makes sense.
Yep.
Alright. We'll go to the next one. So, how do you exploit a player that barrels too often on the turn? We've got a high turn c-bet frequency.
Is he balanced on the flop?
Yes.
You could check raise more combinations, or just raise depending on the configuration. But if you raise, you could put the player in more tough spots with combinations they probably shouldn't be barreling.
Well, we can say something in more general that we continue more often. So this continuation could be in terms of calling or raising. So do we agree on that we're going to continue more often?
Yep, I agree with that.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
I would agree with that, knowing that the opponent's going to have too much error when he arrives at the river. He's going to have too much non-value range when he gets to the river. So
Yeah, so don't assume that. So this is a player that is barreling too often on the turn, right? But they're still balanced in the number of bluffs and value that they have. Okay, so see on the turn some of their range that could have checked back, and then bet the river is now betting the turn instead, with the intention of checking back the river. Alright, so that sort of thing is going on here. It's not the case that the opponent is just bluffing too much.
So if he checks back the turn, then we lead the river.
Alright, so yeah, that's a good idea. So if you're thinking that the turn check back range is going to be too weak, okay. That's good. What else could you do?
What else? So we already established two things. Continue more often, and if he checks back, we're going to attack on the river.
It's not necessarily the case that you have to continue more from the turn.
It is not?
No, just because the barrel frequency on the turn is high, that doesn't mean that he's over bluffing.
Oh, okay, I see. So if he's going to do that, then we are going to overfold the flop and get a sticky on the turn.
Yeah, good. What else can you do? So we've got two things. So you're overfolding the flop, getting a bit more sticky on the turn. If they check back the turn, you're going to lead the river at a high frequency. Is there anything else that you could do?
Well, if he's barreling inappropriate hands on certain turn cards, like overpairs or single pair hands, when he should be polarizing to two pair plus or whatever is relevant for the situation, then you can start raise bluffing a little bit more.
So yeah, if you raise bluff, he's just going to call. If you're unbalanced there, you're just going to call. he's going to call you. So that's not the answer.
Okay.
Can we say we check raise the flop?
Why would you check raise the flop?
Because if we are gonna overfold the flop, then we have to raise more than GTO versus this opponent to compensate for the overfolding.
No, that's not necessarily the truth.
Okay. Oh, we are slow play.
Yeah, so you slow play to which street?
Slow play on the turn because he's not gonna bluff on the river. We assume he's not gonna be three barrel bluffing enough, so we check raise the turn.
Alright.
We actually slow play until turn.
Yeah, so you slow play until the turn. Good. So yeah, that's the main one. So you slow play until the turn. So your strong hands don't raise a flop. You just delay that raise until the turn. Okay, actually, I'll show the answers. Delay raises until the turn. You fold more of your bluff catches on the flop, and then you fold fewer bluff catches on the turn. You get more sticky on the turn. Right. The reason why you're folding more bluff catches on the flop is because with the turn c-bet frequency being too high, you can't get to showdown as probably as much as you could, as much as you want.
So
although that is made up slightly by the fact that you can lead the river if he checks back.
Okay. How come he stays balanced on the turn if his second barrel frequency is too high?
Yeah, so the ratio of bluffs to value on the turn will still be correct. Right, so his polarity is he's less polar. Right, but the ratio of bluffs to value is correct.
Okay.
So players who barrel too often, usually it means that their range is less polar in that spot. So here on the turn, their range is much less polar, and so that's why you're going to delay your raise until the turn. So you're raising into the less polar range, which is good for you.
Mm-hmm.
Right, you're slow playing the flop because they're betting at a high frequency on the turn. Folding more bluff catches on the flop, folding less bluff catches on the turn. Yeah, that's true. Folding more bluff catches on the flop, it's not a big thing, unless you think that the turn c-bet frequency is very, very high. If it's only a little bit high, then folding more bluff catches on the flop is not quite. You don't quite fold everything just because it's a little bit high, because it being a little bit high is made up back by when they check back the turn. Their range is very weak, and those bluff catches on the flop can then value bet. So really, the folding more bluff catches on the turn and getting on the flop and getting a bit more sticky on the turn applies to c-bet frequencies that are very, very high. But in either case, it's quite true. So you wouldn't really be folding bluff catches that are quite strong unless the turn c-bet frequency is closer to 100, 90 to 100, just because you never get to see that river to value bet him. All right, does that make sense so far?
That makes sense, yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
So the main thing there is delaying your raises till the turn. Okay, so the next bit. So how are you going to exploit a player that barrels too often? So you got a high c-bet frequency on all streets.
Slow play. Continue
Is this
calling.
Is this the extension of the previous question? or you're trying to generalize it? But when you say barrels too often, so it's gonna happen on the turn and river.
Yeah, it's going to happen flop turn river. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, in general, I know typically against players we know are going to barrel, we want to slow play until the street before we know they're going to shut down. So if we know they're going to barrel all three, we can just slow play the top of our value range the majority of the time.
Yeah, the
Because
slow play is fine. How about the bluff catchers, guys? we're gonna overfold a lot on the flop already, and then call down.
But we have to be selective because we're not going to be able to realize our equity with a lot of hands.
Well, that's why we overfold the flop.
Yeah.
We get rid of the middling hands on the flop and just start calling down with of course some bluff catchers and of course some draws. But in terms of the bluff catchers are the one that become hard to play on the turn. So we have to be prepared with good bluff catchers and selective on the flop.
yeah, very good. So you'd want to delay your raises with your value hands until the river. You're going to fold more of your bluff catchers on the flop and the turn. Both the flop and the turn against these bets because they've got a high c-bet frequency. You're folding up a little bit more on the flop because you're going to be seeing the river a little bit less often, even though that is made up by the times that you do see the river. They've got a very weak range, but definitely on the turn because there isn't another street besides showdown there. Right, so those bluff catches that you continue on the flop, you're intending to either value bet or bluff the river if they check back. And if they bet into you again on the turn, you're going to be folding a little bit more often because you know that their c-bet frequency on the river is going to be a bit too high as well. Right, those bluff catches can't really get to showdown without calling the extra bet on the river. So yeah, definitely delaying your raises into the river is a good way to do that. So it leads to this slide. So the main thing with bluff catching is in order to profitably properly bluff catch against an opponent, you need to reach showdown and win more often and more in terms of the pot size than the pot odds that you're paying at the time. Okay, and this applies sort of throughout all of poker. When you're making these bluff catches, make all of their money from essentially getting to showdown and winning against the bluff. Either that's on the river, they make some money by calling the river bet. They're bluffing at a certain frequency that's better than the pot odds that you've paid, and so you can make a bit of profit that way because you're more often going to be up against a bluff than whatever pot odds that you paid.
So can we say if we bluff catch on the river, for that specific hand we are holding, we have won the maximum?
I don't really understand that question. You want to say it again?
Well, we win the maximum if we bluff catch on the river, the maximum amount possible, because this is the money that the opponent.
So in that exact spot where your opponent's over bluffing, you win the most by having your opponent bluff into you. Yeah. But this sort of applies on earlier streets as well. So on the turn, when you're thinking about calling with the bluff catcher, you should ask yourself, am I going to reach showdown? And when I do reach showdown, am I going to win? And is this going to happen more than the potters that I'm paying now? Right. Of course, on the turn you do have some equity. You can draw to make a strong hand. So hands which draw to a very very nut hand like a flush draw or a straight draw. The answer to this question is usually yes. You can reach showdown and win by having the deck give you the nuts, essentially, right? But with other sort of bluff catchers with sort of mediocre showdown value, you're thinking, am I going to reach showdown? Am I going to win? Right?
Yeah.
And the answer to those two questions is no, right? Or maybe yes, but not often enough. You should just fold. Right? And once again, extending to the flop and even a little bit less so pre-flop, you're thinking on the flop, am I going to get to showdown? Well, if my opponent is going to barrel on the turn at a high frequency and I'm just going to fold, then I might as well fold now. There's no point me putting in the extra bet and then folding if on the turn I'm always going to fold. Right, and he's always going to bet and I'm always going to fold.
So can we follow the same rule for all the way to pre-flop?
Yeah, you can even consider it pre-flop. Pre-flop is a bit different because you get to see a lot more equity by going from pre-flop to the flop, because you get 3 cards out of your 7 rather than just the extra 1 card out of your 7 going from the flop to the turn.
Oh, I see.
Or turn to river. So it's a little bit different,
Okay.
but it's the same sort of idea.
So in general, like in multi-street aggressions, it is better to overfold on the first street, right
Yes,
there.
Yes. Yeah. And if you ever get the chance to see me play against Vish, which might happen at some stage, against the flop bet, even with hands like bottom pair, middle pair, or sort of weak pairs, which you would usually consider to be an okay call, those hands can just make it into the muck, because I ask myself the question, can I reach showdown and win? And the answer is, well, no, not enough according to the potters that I'm paying. This hand isn't strong enough. If I make my draw or whatever, because my opponent's range is too strong, exploitatively, I'm going to fold now.
Can we somehow justify calling using implied odds? Let's say we have the bottom.
So it's the same sort of thing here. So probably block actually need to reach showdown and win. So pre-flop, that's a different question. But say on the flop, if you have a good draw, when that draw hits, you're going to be able to value bet and win a good chunk of your opponent's stack. So there, in the case, you can reach showdown and win. Not just can you reach showdown and win against the bluffs, you can also reach showdown and win against the value, because your draw completes and you can value bet that draw. Which is the reason why in Sims and stuff, Sims very rarely fold a flush draw on the flop. Right?
Yeah.
It's a very rare thing to happen, and even on the turn they very rarely fold them. Just because when you answer this question, can you reach showdown and win? The answer is, well, yes.
So we can say the same thing for the pairs, bottom pair or middle pair. There are also like 5 out draws, and then if
it's a bit different if you're up against the kind of player that's going to bet their own pairs. So, and you got the reverse implied odds with getting out kicked, kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
When you make trips or whatever.
Yeah, they're reverse. Okay.
But it's the main sort of thing you got to ask yourself: is my opponent gonna barrel too much? Right. If my opponent's barreling too much, right, and barreling at a very high frequency, if I expect my opponent to bet at sort of 80, 90 sort of percent frequency on the next street, then I might as well fold now, because that sort of 10 to 20% chance they check back, and then I can value bet or whatever, isn't going to make up for the pot odds that are paid now.
Mm-hmm.
So any questions about that?
What's the thought process then of making like a flop decision where we're faced with unknown bet sizes coming? Like where's the like how do you quantify the bet size with unknown bet sizes approaching?
Yeah, so it's not. Well, you have to be firstly confident enough in your read, and part of that read would be what bet size your opponent's likely to use on the next street.
Mm-hmm.
But to answer your question more thoroughly, it matters less the bet size that your opponent's using and more how often they're betting, right? Because if you call now and then your opponent has an 80% chance of betting the next street, and then you're going to fold, right? You essentially have an 80% chance of folding on the next street. And so that 20% time that you don't, sure, you might win the pot, but does that 20% match the pot odds that you paid? And often the case, no, it isn't, right? If against a half pot bet, you're paying a pot odds 25%, but if you only manage to get to showdown and win 20% of the time, it's not there for you.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions about this sort of concept? So ask yourself when you're deciding on whether to bluff catch on any street, really. Can I get to showdown? Can I win when I get to showdown? How often does this happen? Right? Does this sort of justify the pot odds that I'm paying to get?
Can
to
you say
showdown?
an example? Like, let's say on the flop, the player we are playing, he bets pot. So the pot odds over there, you're saying we gotta win more than pot if we are gonna make a call here.
Yeah. So the pot odds are 33%.
Okay.
So you need to get showdown and win more than 33% of the time. That's sort of the exploitative way of looking at it.
Oh, so the second part of this is the frequency. I thought it is the amount of the EV.
Yeah, it's the amount as well as the frequency. If you're just looking at it in terms of the frequency, then it's the 33% of the time. If you're looking at the amount, then it's the pot that you played, that you've paid on the flop.
Okay, got it. Wow.
So, for example, you've got like you're in the big blind and you're up against a board like King 7-2, and you got like 3-deuce suited or 5-deuce suited, something like that, and you're up against an opponent that you know is going to barrel a lot on the next street. Even against a very sort of small bet on the flop, you can consider folding there and then if you don't have any additional sort of backdoor equity, like with a backdoor flush draw kind of thing, because on the next street your opponent's going to bet at high frequency and you're just going to fold. Right, and when your opponent checks back the turn, your hand isn't strong enough to value bet and you might get bluffed off it on the river. So those sort of things you got to think about.
Mm-hmm.
It could be the case that your opponent, instead of betting the flop at a high enough frequency, they have too many checkbacks on the flop, and so the range which they do bet on the flop ends up barreling too often. Right, so their EV sort of made up from when your opponent checks back the flop when they shouldn't be.
Right.
Any other questions?
The interesting thing is that once I tried to use solver to simulate these things, but because these reads are depending on the future streets, I could not do the node locking for the future streets. So like we cannot simulate a player that 3 barrels using GTO plus.
Yeah, it's difficult because you have to tell the solver exactly what you want, and it's difficult to even sort of think about how you would code
Yeah.
that. All right, let's move on. So question 5. So how are you going to exploit a player that doesn't c-bet enough on the flop? So say you're in the big blind and you've called and opened. Right, how are you going to exploit this player?
Are we out of position?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
But how are you going to exploit the player?
C-bet.
Let's say you're out of position just to make it
Okay,
easy.
let's say we are in the big blind and then it doesn't c-bet. So it means his c-bet range is value heavy.
That's not necessarily true. You could just check back that value.
Oh, he's that tricky. If he c-bets too much, we should start check raising. So if he's not c-betting often, we can start leading. Or maybe not.
Yep. So that's the answer there. So you start to lead more, and it sort of goes back to the rationale behind the 50% rule.
Right.
If you've got a strong hand and your opponent is betting enough, you can get 2 bets by going for a check raise. But if your opponent isn't betting enough, you have to bet yourself. And so the answer to this question, if your opponent isn't c-betting enough on the flop, what you do is you donk more often on the flop. And you can sort of extrapolate this to other streets as well. If your opponent isn't going to c-bet enough on the turn, say they bet the flop and you've called, and the turn comes and you know that on this particular turn card, the player that you're up against isn't likely to c-bet this turn card very often, then what you should do to exploit that is to start donking that turn card. Right, and same sort of thing on the river. So donking is an incredibly powerful sort of exploitative tool that you have in your sort of tool belt. So you want to use it, and you use it in the spots that you know that your opponent isn't going to bet into you enough when you check, and make sure that your donking range can still be quite well balanced. Right, have a good mix of hands that are going to take the variety of different lines, such as betting the flop and then sort of checking the turn and then checking the river, or betting the flop and then barreling off, or something like that. But the idea is your betting range is going to be slightly stronger than your checking range, and because of that, your checking range has fewer nutted hands in it relative to your betting range, and so when you check, your opponent is sort of incentivized to bet into you. But if your opponent isn't going to bet into you, you can leave that checking range very weak and donk quite basically all of your strong hands instead. And the weak checking range gets to catch up essentially by seeing the turn more often. And so what would happen is that you would donk more often on the flop, and then when your opponent does c-bet, because your checking range was quite weak, you got to be folding more often.
We do what?
You got to fold more often because your checking range is very weak.
And can we say if he c-bets, usually his range is strong.
It's not necessarily that it's strong. It's just going to be stronger than your checking range,
Okay.
which is why you overfold. Right? You've constructed your ranges so that your donking range has basically all of your strong hands in it, and you've done this because your opponent isn't betting enough when you check. So when you do check, your range is very weak, and
But the good
because your
thing
range
is
is
that
so weak, you can overfold.
we can check some draws there because we know we are gonna see the turn more. Okay.
All right, does that make sense to everyone?
Yep, very good.
Yes.
All right, so nice little easy one to finish things off. So how do you exploit a play that underfolds the river? How do you exploit a play that overfolds on the river?
We never bluff.
Yeah, so if they underfold, you never bluff, and if they overfold,
We can always bluff.
We always bluff.
yeah, very good. All right. So any questions about the stuff that we've talked about so far? So it's got a bit of a summary here. So basically, a lot of the questions that I've had about exploits recently is going to be about sort of how you're going to bluff catch. Okay, so the rule of thumb is just overfold on any street the opponent is going to underbluff. Underfold on streets your opponent is going to overbluff. And then always, but still always sort of think, am I going to reach showdown and win? Right? If even if your opponent is overbluffing, your hand might not be strong enough to reach showdown and win. Right? The bluffs that your opponent might choose to use might have some showdown value. They might be like ace highs and stuff. And if you're considering only calling a king high or a weak draw or something like that, then it still might not be profitable given the potters that you get. Alright, so does anyone have any specific questions about exploits? That you want to go over? Don't know who that is. Kali here. Yeah, I don't have that feature with this one.
Think about to go over and just give it some thought in future. And it is about the players that every time we check back the flop, he leads down the turn. Or when we are out of position, every time we check, he stabs, which has something to do with the 50% rule. But the first case that he leads the turn is something to just good to think about how we could exploit such an opponent, because if we want to check back our values to punish him on the turn, we might miss some value right there on the flop. But if we bet all values on the flop, then we cannot punish him on the turn when he leads to us. So it becomes a little bit tricky.
Yeah, well, you can always. So let's break that up a bit first. So you've got the question: if you check back the flop, your opponent's always going to lead the turn. Okay, so think about what that means for you. If you check back the flop and your opponent always leads the turn, that essentially means that if you got a strong hand, you always get an extra bet from your opponent's range. Versus if you bet the flop, then you get a bet some percentage of the time, right? Because your opponent's going to fold. Let's just say half the time, right? So say you pot it and your opponent folds half the time. Versus if you check back, your opponent's always going to pot it into you. All right.
Well, there are issues to giving him free cards because of the runouts could like lower our value hand, or there are some vulnerable hands we cannot afford to check back to the flop. So these may cancel each other.
Yeah, not usually the case that if your hand is so vulnerable, you would want to bet it anyway.
But let's say I have bottom set. So am I gonna check back bottom set to just hopefully he leads to me on the turn?
You got to think about how often they're leading on the turn. Okay.
I see.
So when you're thinking about whether or not you should bet this hand on the flop versus checking back the flop and then raising the turn, you have to think about how often they're going to bet the turn. So if they're going to bet the turn at a very high frequency, we're talking like 80%, something like that, 80%, 90%, 100%. Then yeah, if you've got a very strong hand, you should be checking back the flop and then raising the turn, because that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to capture extra value from that. But if you've got like a weaker hand, right, then what you could do is, instead of checking back the flop and facing this big bet, you could just bet the flop yourself, right, and then see the river.
Yes, but I am talking about our 3 street value hands.
Yeah, so
I
you
understand
can just check
that
back the flop and then raise the turn and then bet the river. So that way you've got three bets, right?
So we gotta raise the turn, right?
Yes, the checking back the flop was with the intention of raising the turn.
Yeah, because I was thinking if we are gonna go for the line bet, maybe we win a bigger pot compared to checking back the flop.
Well,
and now
you can check back the flop and you can raise the turn, or you can even call the turn and raise the river. Either way, you get 3 bets in. You just got to think about how often those 3 bets get called or occur. So if your opponent, just to say a hypothetical opponent who always leads the turn, so they lead the turn with 100% range, if you check back, but if you bet, and for a pot size bet, but if you bet pot yourself, they only continue 50% of the time. If you've got a strong hand, right, like a nuts or a near nut hand, if you bet, you only win the pot, an extra bet half the time, a pot size bet half the time. But if you check, you essentially win a pot size bet all the time, because your opponent is going to give that to you by betting themselves.
Ooh.
So the exploit there would be to, if you've got the nut in hand, just check back the flop and then either raise the turn or call the turn, raise the river, right? And so you end up getting 3 bets in more often, right? That first pot size bet happens more often because you check back and your opponent gives it to you, versus you trying to take it out of them by betting yourself. And then in terms of the raises, you can raise the turn and then bet the river, or call the turn and then raise the river. Either way, you get 3 bets in, which is the same as going bet.
Sure, I see. and if he leads like 90% of the time instead of 100, can we say we should bet those nutty hands on the flop at least on some frequency, because
No.
he's not always leading on the turn.
No. So you just have to evaluate what you think your expectation is from the two cases. So there on the flop, if you bet and he calls 50% of the time, you win one bet 50% of the time. But if you check and he bets 90% of the time, you win a bet 90% of the time. And so 90% of the bet is higher than 50% of the bet. So the EV, the expectation in checking back is much higher. So you should always check back.
Oh, I see. Wow, shit. So if he's leading more than a certain frequency, and we should check back all the time. If he's leading more than a certain more than the frequency is gonna continue with.
Yeah, usually you're thinking about if they're leading more than 50% of the time, 50%ish of the time, but often it's even more than like 30% of the time, right?
Right.
If you look at sort of Sims and how often they lead the turn after it checks back, unless the turn card is just amazing for the range asymmetry, the out of position player is checking a lot, and that's got to do with on the flop. Those strong hands didn't have to bet. They could check back and then bluff catch the turn. They could check back and then raise the turn.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, this is something. This is a tendency that.
Yeah. Although I will say something. If you got a strong hand and you bet, there is a chance that you get raised. So that's a way you get a fourth bet in. But you sort of have to factor that in slightly to your calculation there.
Oh yeah, so you're saying if we have a strong hand, sometimes we bet and he raises us.
Yeah.
On the flop.
Yeah, but that might add a few extra percentages in terms of
not checking back all the time.
Yeah, towards not checking back, but.
Oh. Well, I found it anyway hard to implement because most of the times we don't have those type of nutty hands, locked hands on the flop. Most of the times the value hands we have on the flop are somehow vulnerable on most turns. So we cannot implement this way.
I don't think that all those value hands are vulnerable.
Let's say we have top pair good kicker and we want to bet.
Top pair good kicker isn't usually that vulnerable.
Yeah, I see.
Usually top pair good kicker is going to win the hand.
So you mean it is a decent candidate to check back and raise the turn with?
Well, not necessarily raise, but you can check back and then
call.
Like, is that top pair good kicker hand going to bet 3 streets anyway?
No,
probably not.
Most of the times, no. Yeah,
it's probably just going to bet 2 streets. So, like, you have to think about, okay, how am I going to maximize my EV with this hand, even though I'm going to only get two bets in? I only want to get 2 bets in. How do I do it? So I've got to think about where to do it. Will I bet the flop and then bet the turn and then check the river? Will I bet the flop and then check back the turn and then bet the river? Will I check back the flop and then bet the turn and then bet the river? So those are the different lines that you could take to get 2 bets out of 3. But there's also other sub lines you have to think about. If you bet and you get raised, so something that's 2 bets, and so you would call and then you'd have to just check back if your opponent checks. Although your opponent is basically showing some extreme weakness there. Or if you check back the flop, your opponent could bet into you.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so you have to think about that as well. So if your opponent is going to bet into you at a very high frequency, then you get your 2 bets at a high frequency, right? The range that your opponent bets into you on the turn is weaker than the range that you're up against after your opponent calls the flop.
That's right.
Because of that, you end up winning more by checking back on the flop.
Also, I was thinking about how there are plenty of scenarios where if you're in position You might bet 1/3 or quarter pot on the flop, and then whenever you check back and your opponent stabs at a high frequency, he'll be sizing up quite a bit. So that could increase your expectation as well.
Yeah, you have to have a good enough read to know that your opponent's going to stab the turn. Going to probe the turn very often with a big bet size.
This is a line that happens almost with high frequency versus a certain opponent. We can get the samples quickly, like in a few hours playing live, because like we play heads up at some spot and I check back, I see, oh, he lead the turn. Another hand, he does the same thing. So we can collect the samples and be reliable saying he leads the turn every time I check back, or at least with high frequency.
Yeah, I mean, you want to make sure that you're not looking at something you're not just looking at noise there. But yeah, if you're confident enough in your read, then you have to make the correct exploit there. Right, it's sort of an exploit that you're making on the flop to exploit something that your opponent's done on the turn. So you do want to evaluate which strategic option is going to give you the highest
most
payout.
EV.
Yeah, the highest expected payout. Yeah. So any other exploits anyone wants to discuss? Any other spots you think people are not playing so well?
The other one was the stab beat one. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was in a situation where it's like button versus the blinds. When I feel that, or I have some evidence that the blinds are three betting too much versus the button steal or open. As long as we keep to the correct four bet and calling frequencies, I don't think we can be exploited by people who three bet too much. But as far as exploiting them, would widening our four bet range be a feasible exploit?
So you're talking about someone that three bets too often. Yeah, usually if they three bet too often, their range is much weaker, and so you can just four bet more.
But another adjustment you can make is that you open tighter. Open with the hands that you can tolerate the three bet. So
right.
The thing I had is that any opponent is gonna put pressure on you on a certain street. Let's say you have a game tree, and on one of these branches of the tree, the opponent is gonna put pressure on you. So let's say here pre-flop, he's gonna three bet you a lot. So we start right there with the hands that can tolerate that pressure. So we don't open with the hands that are gonna fall to three bet from the get go.
I see.
Yeah,
And then of course,
the flip side is that when your opponent doesn't three bet you, they're essentially waving the white flag, so their calling range just gets gutted, and then you can win a lot of EV from that.
Oh, you're right.
So you have to think about exactly what you're doing. Sure, you're gonna four bet more. You might fold a little bit more instead of raising, instead of opening, because of that. But you might just end up doing stuff like opening more hands, which block the three betting range and unblock the calling range, and then when your opponent does call, you're going to be betting the flop very often because they're quite weak, because they don't have enough strong hands in their three betting range.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
All right. So any other spots anyone wants to discuss?
What about people that are range betting small on just about every flop?
Yeah, so if they're range betting quite small, it usually means their range is very merged. So the answer there is to raise quite a lot, right? So you're never going to donk because they're betting all the time, and you just want to raise a lot. And the other thing is, going back, even thinking about to sort of pre-flop, you can start doing stuff like trapping a bit more. And not really trapping, it's just like you're not going to be three betting as often with your sort of bigger hands.
Okay, so you're grabbing more EV by flatting a slightly stronger range.
Yeah, and you would probably also fold a bit more. Say you're in the big blind and you're sort of defending against a player that's just going to range bet. You probably fold a little bit more because your opponent's c-betting frequency is too high. And if they always range bet, then you can fold quite a lot because you never get to see the turn.
We can check raise them too.
Yeah, so you're going to have a little bit more stronger hands from pre-flop. You're not going to be calling as wide pre-flop, and you're going to check raise more. So it's a few different things that go into that. You not calling as often pre-flop gets made up by those sort of strong hands getting more EV by check raising.
So, how far would we go in terms of folds pre-flop? Say, versa. I'll give you just an example. Versa 3x open, I might, king 9 off might be kind of borderline, right?
Against a 3x open, you can fold a lot of hands to start off with.
Yeah, what I'm asking is how many more hands would we fold versus someone who's, say, range betting third pot in position? So if the cutoff is king nine,
definitely anything that you thought was optional would be a fold, and then some further things. Because what's really going on is that your opponent is they've made this first bet and they're guaranteed to make a second one. So you want hands that are going to sort of see the turn.
Yeah. Would we change?
So I have a question, Thomas.
Would we change the type of hands that we're calling with?
Yeah, so it's going to be tighter.
Yeah.
Just in general.
Do they have to be hands that flop like stronger kind of front end equity? Like do the suited connectors and stuff go way down in value if someone's?
No, it's not necessarily that's the case. It's because your opponent's going to be range betting a bit more, but they're going to be betting it for a smaller size. So a fair chunk of their hands are going to be okay just to call because your opponent's range that has bet the flop is very weak. You just want to have more hands that will check raise.
All right.
So that could just be you're going to fold slightly more often pre-flop, but not a huge amount.
Okay.
If they're range betting small on flops that are like just not optimal for small for range betting, like the low and middle flops, connected flops, and that there we can exploit by raising quite significantly. Correct?
Yeah. If you look at some of the range bet spots in the sims that I've made on the paired boards, you've got like a 30% raising frequency against the quarter sized bet on like a king 7 or a 10 5 kind of thing. So when they're making these range bets, you can check raise like a lot of hands. We're talking sort of like a third of your range can,
Right. Yep.
and obviously because it's such a wide range of hands that you're check raising, it would be for a smaller size.
Like 50%, like a
Yeah, like
like a
50%. Any other questions?
I do have one.
Yeah.
So once we are in the big blind and we face open as an RFI, in the charts I see there are some hands that are yellow. I think they're yellow because if we call all the time, we're gonna lose EV. I mean, if we call all the time, they're too weak to call all the time. So we gotta raise them sometimes as a bluff. Let's say big blind versus hijack 3 big blind open, and we have 9-7 suited. If 9-7 suited is yellow here, if we call all the time with 9-7 suited, we lose money. So we are gonna raise it here, and I assume it is as a bluff. So, but if the player doesn't fold to 3-bet bluffs, do we fold 9-7 suited, although it is yellow here?
Yeah,
How?
no. Just because it's yellow, if it's yellow, it means that you're going to make. It's going to be possibility to call and possibility to raise, and the EV of
That's
raising
right.
and calling is the same. So you would just call.
So why do we raise 9-7?
Yeah. So you're raising it because it's a good bluff to have.
And also because if we call all the time,
If
we lose
if
money.
you call all the time, your expectation is just going to be the same as your calling expectation. Your opponent isn't going to change the way that they play very, very much.
Okay, so if from the yellows, if the opponent doesn't fold to 3-bets, they're all become calls.
Yeah.
We never fold them.
Yeah. It's different if it's blue. If it's blue, then you got raise, call, fold. Then you can fold them.
Yeah, like if 5-4 suited is yellow versus under the gun, why is it yellow? Because it is good to be as a bluff. Sometimes.
Yeah, it's good to bluff that sometimes. You want to have it in your 3-betting range.
Okay, and then if we don't want to bluff because
You
he
would just
never
call.
folds, we just call. Okay, I thought we should fold sometime because they are bluffs. We never bluff.
Well, no, it's yellow because it's good enough to call as well. Otherwise, I would have made it blue.
Okay. But I'm sure I have seen one of the reasons that a hand is yellow because the EV of calling and EV of bluffing is close. Why each one has its own benefits? Calling has its own benefits, so it happens with a certain frequency. And bluffing also happens with some frequency because it has some benefits.
Yeah.
But if we don't want to bluff, okay, we just call it. Okay, now I know. They're strong enough. They're still strong to call.
Yeah, that's why they're yellow. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I made it blue, then yeah, you can fold.
Sure.
Yeah, if calling was no good, it'd be raise or fold, right? And
Yeah, or pink. Yeah. There is a raise, call, fold, or raise or fold.
Yeah.
The preflop charts are probably going to get like a massive overhaul with my book and the new preflop ranges that I'm making. So
What is going to be? There's going to be like an updated version?
yeah, the book there's going to be preflop ranges that I'm specially making for my book, and there's going to be updated, so they're going to be newer than the ones that I have up on the website.
Is it printed in color?
Yeah, it'll be printed in color. Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool.
So like, well, what's happening with my book is that I'm getting it printed here, and then I'm mailing it out to everyone.
Right.
Like I'm not like going through some third party that prints it and then mails it. I'm like manually printing X number of books, and then I'm picking them up and then putting them in the post, and then hopefully through the magic of international post networks, it gets to you guys. So yeah, enjoy that.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to that.
Yeah, and the some of the preflop sims that I've made, you should get access to that Wednesday. I think I'll put up a link so that you can access it, and only the people who have gone through the pre-sale will have their Zenith Poker account able to access them.
Right.
Great,
All right.
thank you.
So, any other questions in terms of the stuff that we've discussed today? Bit of exploits and stuff. Just need to go through the slides real quick. Yeah, so I think I've covered those learning outcomes, review questions, over bluffing, under bluffing, call, fold, so that sort of dynamic. Talking about players that bet on certain streets and fold on certain streets, generally you're just going to fold if they're under bluffing. But if they're barreling too often, you have to sort of assess how often you're going to get to the river. Right. And then we're going to talk about other stuff when your opponent's c-bet enough on probing too often and sort of that sort of thing. So overall, the main idea is get enough of a sample so that your read is quite strong, and then when you've got a strong read, use it as often as you can. Right? There's no point sort of spending all that time in picking up the read if you're not going to use it. And don't overthink the sort of exploits that you're making. If you make your exploits too complicated, then what's going to happen is you'll end up making mistakes somewhere and you'll just end up spewing. So really what you should do is have a good clean read, right? You can write down in a sentence or two about what your opponent is doing. Then you can write a single sort of sentence about what your exploit is with the different kinds of hands in your range, and it shouldn't be very complicated. It shouldn't be stuff like, with XYZ I'm going to check raise the flop and then check raise the river and then check call the turn or whatever, because it being too complicated means that you'll likely made a mistake somewhere in your reasoning.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned in the previous module on this, based on the strength of our reads, that sort of dictates just how much, how much the magnitude, I think is the word used, of our exploits.
Yeah. So stronger reads means that you should be making bigger exploits.
Right.
And you if your read is very strong, you'll do stuff that just doesn't make sense in terms of GTO, but it does make a lot of sense in terms of the read that you've.
Right.
I have seen the rare. I mean, usually drastically deviating from GTO usually is not a good idea to drastically, because we don't get to that read which is so reliable that often. Because I see some people have a tendency, but once they win on that session, that tendency is gone. When they drink, that tendency is, so that read is not gonna stay for long because of the, I don't know what is it that it makes it unstable. So one read is not always valid for all the time. It changes. So because of this level of uncertainty, we cannot drastically deviate from GTO.
Yeah, that's a good point to remember. A lot of your reads that you do have aren't going to be very strong, and so the deviations that you're going to make aren't going to be very, very big. It's really only when you have very strong reads that you can make very big deviations.
And if we make like smaller deviations, if we use hands that are like mixed strategy hands, that lessens. I mean, it lessens the how much we can be exploited for exploiting, if that makes any sense. If we use hands that have a mixed strategy and we lean towards one side or the other, that makes us less exploitable in our exploitation when you're looking close to the equilibrium, right?
Yeah, I mean, counter exploits are something to worry about when you're playing against very, very strong opponents.
Right.
Usually when you're playing against opponents that are very strong, you just want to play close to GTO anyway. What we've been talking about is when you're playing against sort of weaker opponents and you want to get that extra few BB per 100 against them, what you should be doing.
Right. So in other words, don't worry about getting exploited until we've eaten all the low hanging fruit kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Understood. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I see a player is just obviously, shamelessly bidding large, and it's just too obvious he has it, but he gets paid, so nobody's paying attention that much. So I had a bad habit of leveling myself, saying if I do this, it is just too obvious. But it is not too obvious. If I become value heavy and just bet big for value, I still get paid. So this is something that I had as my concern back in the day, that don't stick to GTO, don't change your sizing and all these things. But people are just not paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, the players that aren't paying attention are the players that make up the bulk of your paycheck. So definitely welcome them. Be nice to those players. Ask them to come back and play more often, because they're going to be your bread and butter, especially if you're sort of a live player, because they're not going to sort of make these adjustments. They're going to give off information to you,
Right,
so that you can make your own exploits, and then they're not going to try and exploit you back. Right, they're not going to try and make any changes in the way that they've played to sort of fix any mistakes that they've made. Right, and because they're not fixing any mistakes that they've made, you're going to take as much of an advantage against those mistakes as you possibly can.
I like it.
all right.
All right, so any last questions?
No, but if you could post this, because I didn't take notes because I was paying attention. I'd love to take notes on all this. So if you could post the recording, that would be awesome.
Yep, I'll do that. Any other questions?
Yeah, thanks.
No.
All right. Hopefully you guys learned something. I'll turn the recording off now. Anyone who is watching at home, thanks for watching. Sorry about that technical difficulties earlier on.